Today, I want to warn you that you better not change your church if you know what's good for you. Back in a moment. I don't know how many of you out there are DIYers, do-it-yourself. I am, and it doesn't always work out very well. In fact, most of the time it doesn't. When it comes to car mechanics, for example, I've learned never to really work on my own car unless I want to see it get worse. I don't have any mechanical abilities when it comes to cars. But when it comes to making repairs on my house, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And recently, I had an experience that I want to share with you that has a lot to do with your church. I was in my upstairs bathroom the other day when I noticed that the faucet was dripping. And when I went to turn it off, well, it didn't stop dripping, which told me that I was going to need to do a little work. Now, normally you might just take off the parts and maybe replace the gaskets and that sort of thing. But when I looked at the actual faucet itself, it had been around for 25 years. It's kind of a two-sink dynamic in our bathroom upstairs. And I looked at it and I said, you know, I really just need to replace the faucets altogether. They're pretty nasty. They're kind of gnarled. They've got all kinds of problems with them. They look terrible. So I went down to the local Home Depot to see what was there, and I found a couple of faucets were priced reasonably well. So I decided to buy 2 faucets, brought it back, and I was going to be the do-it-yourself guy that fixed our plumbing situation. I mean, why would I spend a couple of $100s to put in a couple of faucets? Not going to happen. I'm way too cheap. So anyway, I looked at the directions and it seemed very easy to do. Just take out the old and put in the new. With a couple of wrench moves and using a screwdriver here and there, it looked like I could do the job pretty well in maybe about an hour. So you know what the rest of the story is all about, don't you? Because it's one thing to put in a new faucet, but it's another thing to take one out. And that's what I was going to discover. So when I crawled under the sink, I began to discover the things that you typically discover when you do a DIY project. And that is that the old is got some problems, and getting the old out really requires a lot more labor than you considered. So I'm crawling under the sink and I'm noticing there's not a lot of space under there. I'm also noticing there's a lot of work that was done under there by the house builders that was probably shortcuts and maybe one of the reasons I was having problems to start with. But getting under there was no easy task. When I finally situated myself under there, I found that the parts that I needed to remove, well, they were just about welded. I mean, to move them, and some of them were even plastic parts, but they didn't move very well. Everything was really locked in there. And getting the tools in there to get those things out was very frustrating. After a while, I just found that I could not remove that old part, and I had to use other tools that weren't part of the package. I had to get involved in destroying a lot of things that I didn't intend on destroying just to get that old part out. It took for hours. In the middle of it, of course, my wife came in and she asked me what I was doing. I told her I was replacing all this, but it wasn't working out well. And then she did what most women should never do. She started wanting to have a discussion about what to do, which, guys, you know, you don't want to have discussions when things are getting frustrated. So I just said, I love you, honey, but please, I don't want to talk about this right now. And so in the middle of that whole thing, I just said, you know, I need to back away from this faucet issue and just stop working before I get too frustrated and things start to break unnecessarily. So I had breakfast or lunch or whatever the time of the day was, and I just relaxed for a while and thought about the problem and thought about attacking it from a different direction. And it needed to be attacked from a different direction because getting that old faucet out was not easy. Well, thankfully, I was able to get that old faucet out. It took a lot longer than I anticipated, and putting the new one in was relatively easy because I understood the whole situation then. Then I moved on to the next sink, and getting the old one out was much easier because I'd learned the first time that it's not that difficult to remove that. However, that also had its own set of problems. When I went to put the new faucet in, I sprung leaks that I didn't anticipate, and they were coming from I couldn't tell where. And now I was putting pots under there, and it was a real disaster again. And not knowing what to do, I learned from my first experience, just stop what you're doing, certainly turn off all the water you have to. What's going on? Think about it. And I thought about it long and hard, and it really was something that was surprising to me because things should have been working, but I discovered that there were other parts in that old system that were broken I did not anticipate. Back I went to Home Depot, had to get new parts that went into the plumbing that, again, I wasn't anticipating. Got that installed, and finally, when it was all said and done, we've got 2 brand new faucets that are working great. Now, what does this have to do with your church? I think everything. You know, when you go to make changes in your existing church, you're going to find that there's tremendous resistance. I don't think that that's a surprise to you, but people get very comfortable with the way things have always been done. But the problem is that the Church of Jesus Christ, especially in the Western world, the United States and Europe, is failing. We're not reaching, generally speaking, we're not reaching the next generation. We are stuck in old ways of doing things. And again, I'm not talking about making cosmetic changes only or necessarily, but I'm talking about the philosophy and the way that we do ministry. It's really stuck in the way we used to do things in time past. If you look around, most churches, particularly smaller churches, but when I say smaller churches, anywhere from 50 to 150, when you look at churches, generally speaking, you look at the age group in those churches, the median age is about 45, 50, 60, and even older. You're not seeing people in their 20s and 30s going to church very often. And usually an excuse is made by leadership saying, well, this generation just is more difficult to reach, or it's got this problem, it's got that problem. But honestly, the real problem is we're stuck with the old faucets. We're still using those old faucets, even though they're leaking, even though they're no longer adequate, even though they're out of date. We keep using those old faucets and we keep trying to make them work, but they're designed to fail. You know, some people have on their websites, we have contemporary worship, but when you go to their worship services, the songs they're singing are from the 80s and the 90s of the last century. Now, most of the people who are going to those churches love those songs. They've been singing them forever, and they think those songs are contemporary. But folks, if you're singing songs that were made in the 80s and the 90s, you're singing songs that are 30 and 40 years old. And to a generation who are in their 20s, that's just old stuff. It's ironic because many of us, when we got involved with Christianity, perhaps were younger people ourselves, and we looked at some of those old songs as being really out of date. Well, you know what? Now everything is in reverse, isn't it? A lot of the worship songs that we're using today are 10, 20, and 30 years old, and we're really not investigating some of the new stuff that's out there. Now, some of the new stuff that's out there stinks, just like some of the old stuff stinks. But we need to be in a place where we're willing to change what we do. We're not supposed to get stuck in traditions that have nothing to do with the New Testament. You know, a lot of us, again, who are in our 40s, 50s, 60s, particularly me, I'm in my 60s. When I grew up, there was no internet. There was no such thing as the internet. In fact, the internet didn't come into play until I was in my mid-20s. But the generations we're trying to reach never understood a world, never saw a world without the internet. The internet is as much a part of their worldview as the plants and animals. So when we look at the church, we have a different way to look at things, and we reference things that are comfortable to our way of looking at things. But if we're going to reach new generations, we need to change some of the ways we think and the ways we do, and we need to look at things differently. The gospel never changes. The way we share the gospel does. We need to be open to new methods. We need to be aware of those things. And as leaders, I got to tell you something, it's difficult to take old congregations and bring them into the new, just like it's difficult to take an old faucet out. You look at it and you say, you know, we're just going to bring in new music, or we're going to bring in new technology, we're going to change some of the color schemes, we're going to try some new things this way, we're going to have a new outreach program, whatever it is. And maybe as a leader, you're excited about it. Maybe you've been to a seminar and you say, you know, this is what we need to do to reach more people. And so you begin to talk to your leadership and talk about getting these things implemented, and you find a lot of resistance. People want things the way they want them, and it's going to be painful. As a leader, you're going to probably need to step back, like I needed to just step back. When I tried to get that old stuff out, it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. And so I had to be patient. I had to step back and say, now how can we get this out so that it doesn't damage the entire sink area? And that's important, because You don't have to lose people who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s in order to reach new generations. You just need to re-envision them. And you need to take them, sometimes gently, you need to take them through change. You need to talk with them and have conversations with them and say, listen, you need to understand that I honor the traditions that we've come into, but in order for us to reach this next generation, we're going to need to make some changes. Some of them will be cosmetic, some of them will be the way we do things, but we will never leave the gospel. Our main message is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. We will never abandon the gospel. But some of the ways that we've been doing things are stuck in the past. We need to have these conversations with people who've been longtime attenders of our church, because if we don't, we're going to be still stuck in the past. And I've got to tell you, I look at a lot of churches in the region that I am. Most of those churches are still stuck in 20 years and 30 years ago. And they're still doing things the same old way. Now, just slapping a new coat of paint on the sanctuary doesn't change things. It really is the way that we do things. We as leaders need to be open to changes in our culture, changes in our society. The gospel never changes, but the way we reach people may. As an example, when I was first born again as a teenager, we used to go out on the street and we used to pass out tracts, we used to talk to people in parks, we used to knock on doors, we do all these kind of things. None of that really happens anymore, and none of that is effective anymore because it's a different culture we live in. You start knocking on doors and immediately you're a Jehovah's Witness. They don't want to talk to you. And so if you try those old methods today and try to reach people with those old methods, you're going to find people much more resistant. We need to be in a place where we're willing to make changes in the way we approach people. We need to understand how they access new information. We need to take a serious look at the internet, because people are on it hours and hours and hours a day. We need to look at media. And again, you're not going to be able to compete fully with media out there because there's millions and millions of dollars invested into it. But we can look at media in a different way and say, how can we use media in a way that's going to attract people to Christ? Not just hitting them over the head with the gospel, because that never works, but quite frankly, ministering to them in a way that they understand. I hope this has been an encouragement to you. We've got to really look at the things we're removing first and be careful about how we remove them. Take the time to remove them correctly. Things that are going on in your church that have been traditions, that have been ideas that are no longer having a value to people. We need to start pulling that away, because if we don't, we're going to die. And again, maybe you die in the process. If you try to make changes in your church, it's going to cost you more than you think. Sometimes it's cost pastors their jobs because members are dug in and they're just not going to change. In my region, I know of a couple of churches, one of them very near us, and I mean, they are super stuck in the past. And that church has been dying a death for years. And there's only a handful of members, and they're all into their 80s and 90s, and they're going to hold on to that church until the church dies. It's dying. And sometimes churches just need to die because they won't let go of those old traditions. They've lost the vision for the gospel, and they won't let go of that old faucet. Well, that old faucet's going to keep leaking and leaking and leaking until it just breaks altogether. Some churches need to be walked away from. Unfortunately, in some cases, you need to walk away from a church because the leadership will not change. And if you're in that position, I pray for you. But if you are a leader who's got some people who are willing to listen, it's time to talk to them about having a fresh look at reaching people with the gospel, making changes in the way you do things, in even your style of service, looking at the songs you're doing. Sometimes you can celebrate the old by hymns and that sort of thing. That's nothing wrong with that. And in combining it and getting people involved in the new and having both generations feed off of one another, that's a healthy way to look at change. Anyway, I hope this has been an encouragement to you today. Make the changes that God wants you to make. Talk to your leadership about the things that need to be adjusted to reach this next generation. Don't let your church die from old age. Before we go, as you know, I end each podcast with a quote especially for you. And this one is from Elon Musk, who said, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time. Hey, before you go, can you please leave me a comment, like, and subscribe? I would greatly appreciate it.